Go. Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. This is weird. I can hear myself. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event on beauty and science and interdisciplinary conversation. It is a great delight to see you all here. I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, sociologist from the Catholic University of America, and along with my friend and colleague, Professor Rob Gilbert here at Magdalen College, I'm really delighted to welcome you to this event on beauty and science. We're going to get started today with a series of very brief presentations on a topic that has been addressed from a variety of perspectives. It's been my pleasure to follow this conversation as a sociologist, reading the work of philosophers and scientists and trying to then figure out to what extent these perspectives are represented in the scientific community. And so you'll hear the perspectives of scientists from a variety of disciplines, mathematics and medicine, philosophy, physics, biology, and then what I offer is a sociological analysis of the distribution of some of these perspectives across these fields. So we'll start with Ben MacArthur talking about truth and beauty in physics and biology. Then James McAllister on beauty and theory in science. Milena Ivanova, beauty and experiment in science. Robert Gilbert talking about beauty in nature and in data. Sabine Hossenfelder talking about how beauty leads physics astray. And then finally, I will talk about an empirical assessment of this work on beauty and science. So to briefly introduce our speakers before we begin, in fact, let me put it there. Dr. Ben MacArthur is our first speaker, and he is Director of AI for Science and Government and Deputy Program Director for Health and Medical Sciences at the Alan Turing Institute. He's also professor in the Faculty of Medicine and the School of Mathematical Sciences at the University of Southampton. Dr. James McAllister is Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at Leiden University and is the author of Beauty and Revolution in Science. Dr. Milena Ivanova is Bi-Fellow at Fitzwilliam College at the University of Cambridge. She's a co-editor of The Aesthetics of Science, Beauty, Imagination, and Understanding, published by Routledge in 2020, and author of Duhem and Holism, published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press. She's currently co-editing a book on the aesthetic nature of scientific experiments. Unfortunately, she's not feeling well. She's been hit by a pretty bad case of COVID, so she'll join us virtually. Dr. Robert Gilbert is Professor of Biophysics in the Nuffield Department of Medicine and Director of the University of Oxford, Oxford Medical Sciences Graduate School. He's also the author of Science and the Truthfulness of Beauty. Dr. Sabine Hossenfelder is Research Fellow at the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Studies. She's the author of Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray, published in 2018 by Basic Books, and a brand new book, Existential Physics, A Scientist's Guide to Life's Biggest Questions, that's coming up next month, right? She's also creative director of the really popular YouTube channel, Science Without the Gobbledygook. Finally, I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, Associate Professor and Chair of Sociology at the Catholic University of America. I've written some books, but not that interesting. For this particular discussion, I've been doing a project on the role of beauty in science for the last few years. It's been my great pleasure to read these great scholars, their work, and to bring them together for this event. So without further ado, we'll get started with Ben MacArthur talking about truth and beauty in physics and biology. Now, I get a text message by someone saying I have no images. Is that my fault? I'm not sure. But if you all who are watching online have no access to slides, just let us know. If you have any trouble, we'll try to figure it out. But in the meantime, we'll get started with our presentation here. Sharing. I need help to switch to this because I have to move to that there, but it's not. I think it's a PDF.
That's a PDF, yes. It needs to be dragged onto the screen too.
Okay.
Sorry, bear with us 1 second.
Oh yeah, it's right there. If I could ask everyone who's joining us online to please mute yourselves for this presentation.
It's not appearing on there.
Since participants can see it.
Sorry,
Ah. Great. Thank you. Yeah.
While the screen is just being set up, I'll just say that I'm going to give a very personal testimony, if you like, about my experience in this topic. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not really an expert in this topic, I should say. It's something that I have an interest in, and it's something that I've experienced throughout my career. And I wanted to tell you something about that personal experience. And I wanted to perhaps articulate some points of conflict between the way in which, or perceived points of conflict about the way in which biologists and the way in which physicists or mathematicians think about things. I can't move it on.
Let me see that. Oh yeah, you're right. You can't even see this, right? So I wonder if there's a way he can access them.
Okay.
Let me just adjust this for you really quickly. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Does that feel okay?
Yeah, that's good. Okay, all right. Thank you very much. So let me just move on to the next slide. So I want to give you a really short CV. This is not because I think that you'll be particularly interested in my CV, but it has some bearing on what I want to say later on. So let me just take you very quickly through where I've come from. I started off as a mathematician, and as an undergraduate, I would have said that I was interested in pure mathematics. I felt that pure mathematics was like the queen of the sciences. It was the highest state of knowledge, if you like. So I started off with that kind of mindset, and gradually, as I began to study mathematics, I became more and more interested in applied mathematics, so using mathematical models to describe the real world. And so I went on to do a PhD in applied mathematics. In fact, it was in mathematical biology, so I was interested in mathematical modeling of biological systems. I felt at the end of that the mathematics that I was doing was not really speaking to the biologists in the way that I wanted it to. So at that point, I did a postdoc, and amazingly, I was given a job as an experimentalist in a lab doing some cell biology experiments. I wouldn't say that I was converted to becoming a biologist, but I spent a long time working on experiments and working with biologists in that context. I actually did a second postdoc where I was trying to bring those two strands of thought more closely together. And then eventually I got an academic position, and my current position is a joint position between the Faculty of Medicine and the School of Mathematics. So I'm attempting to bring these two ways of thinking together. And so I have some experience in both of them. And I wanted to try and share with you some of my thoughts about that experience. So I'd like to start at the beginning, and I'm going to give you some quotes to kind of illustrate where I'm coming from. So this is a famous mathematician, G.H. Hardy. He spent most of his time in Cambridge, but some time here in Oxford. And so he said this, he was a pure mathematician: beauty is the first test. There is no permanent place in the world for ugly mathematics. And I think this is such an interesting quote. I think it's really interesting because it says, well, there is a kind of immortality. There is something eternal. And that thing that is eternal is mathematical, but it's not just mathematical, it's beautiful mathematics in some way. So his belief really was that beauty was the first test. So if you're a pure mathematician, really that's what you're looking for: elegance, harmony, simplicity, if you like, in your theories. And there's no place for ugly mathematics. It might be right in the sense that it's a workable proof, but it's not right in the sense that it's a good piece of mathematics. So that kind of idea really permeates lots of pure mathematical thinking. I was really interested in pure mathematics for a long time. This is another picture of Paul Erdős, a very famous 20th century mathematician. He had this idea that God has a celestial book. And in this book are written the purest, most elegant proofs. And so his highest compliment to someone was to say, well, this one is from the book, capital T, capital B. He said, you don't have to believe in God, but you should believe in the book. So somehow this is really what we're striving for, this kind of elegance, this kind of beauty in our work. And that kind of thinking really permeates lots of mathematics in my experience. And because lots of physicists come from that kind of mathematical background, it starts to permeate the way in which lots of physicists think as well. So this, of course, is Richard Feynman, a hugely influential physicist. And he said this: you can recognize truth by beauty and simplicity. Inexperienced students make guesses that are very complicated and it sort of looks like it's all right. But I know that it's not true because the truth always turns out to be simpler than you thought. So if you're a young physicist coming to physics or coming to mathematics, and you hear the greats like this say, if you think it's complicated, you're getting it wrong, you're an inexperienced student, well, you don't want to think that of yourself, do you? You want to think that you're a sophisticated student. So these kind of statements are enormously influential in mathematics and enormously influential in theoretical physics. And so this kind of permeates the way in which lots of us think about theory in particular. Now, as I began to have more and more exposure to biologists, I realized that they really don't see things like that at all. So this is a quote from Richard Preston. He's actually a journalist. He writes for the New Yorker. And he said, in biology, nothing is clear. Everything is too complicated. Everything is a mess. And just when you think you understand something, you peel off a layer and find deeper complications beneath. Nature is anything but simple. And so the sort of counterpoint to this very pure way of thinking, this mathematically led way of thinking, doesn't really feature so prominently in the biological sciences. In fact, in the biological sciences, things are enormously complicated. They're rich, you would say. There's diversity, there are, and there's great beauty in that diversity. And so biologists would generally cherish that kind of complexity, that kind of beauty, that kind of feeling that the world is very complicated. And as we peel off one layer, we just get down to more and more depth, more and more complexity. So as I began to work more and more with biologists, I began to feel that this kind of feeling was certainly more present in the biological science community than in the physics community. Now that's not a, that of course is a generality. Not everybody thinks like that, but in general, there seems to be this kind of feelings amongst the biological sciences community. Now, of course, you can bring those two feelings together. This is a quote from the very end of The Origin from Darwin, and he says, there is grandeur in this way of life. From so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and wonderful have been and are being evolved. So there is a kind of interplay between some simple driving principles and the complexity that we observe in the real world. But it's not such a sharp dichotomy as you would see in the physical sciences. So as I began to move more and more into the experimental sciences, I was really interested in interdisciplinary research. You know, how can we bring together different communities? How can we bring biological scientists alongside mathematicians, say, to work collaboratively? And I kind of I wanted to really dissect why it's so difficult to do that. And so, of course, at the very top, if you imagine sort of layers of depth going deeper and deeper and deeper, trying to understand why we have these different ways of thinking. Well, obviously, the biological sciences and the physical sciences are generally interested in quite distinct problems. There is an intersection, of course, with biophysics, but often they're very different interests. Because they come from different places, they have different histories, and those different histories mean that they use different languages to describe the real world. And some of that language is overloaded. So the term model, for instance, has numerous different meanings depending on who is saying it. So those, if you like, are relatively superficial differences that could be overcome, but more deeper than that, they come from slightly different perspectives on the real world. In general, biological sciences, in my experience, are more interested with the sort of here and now diversity of the real world rather than some abstracted realm. So they have a kind of different philosophical underpinning. But below that, I would argue, there is this different conception of what is attractive, what is desirable in science. And from the mathematical side of things, we would think about this sort of pristine world of elegance. And on the biological side of things, we would think about complexity and abundance and so forth. So I began to feel that perhaps at that bottom level, that was one of the main difficulties with bringing the communities together. So having said all that, I wanted to share with you 4 thoughts, and these are just my thoughts really, that I don't hold them very tightly, if you like. They're just openers, if you like, to kick off a discussion. So my first thought is that feelings of beauty and wonder and awe, they're really innate responses to the natural world, and they're primary motivators of our investigation of it. Everybody is seeking something attractive. That the definition of what is attractive might vary from person to person, but that is a primary motivator for us. That's important because what we find beautiful or attractive determines the questions we ask and the answers that we consider plausible. So it's important that it even determines the questions that you would ask. So if you were interested in an answer that was mathematically elegant, you would ask a question that's likely to lead you to that. If you were interested in the abundance and complexity of life, you would ask questions that will lead you to that. So it's very important because it kind of hits to the root of the kinds of things that the kinds of questions that we might ask as scientists. The third one is that our perceptions and our perceptions of beauty are conditioned by our biology and thereby our place in the natural world. So the way in which we think is determined by our biology. So the way that we perceive the world is determined by our biology. So what we find attractive in the world is determined by our biology. So for instance, in my opinion, if we're ever to come to a grand unified theory of anything, we have to account for the fact that the ones doing the theorizing have a particular biology and a particular place in the natural world. And then finally, I would argue that science is the process of exploring the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. So beauty can be a great guide for us, and it can spur us on to looking into the natural world. And beauty can help with us in that, but we shouldn't be dogmatic, of course. This is a picture of, does anyone know what this is a picture of, this dog?
Dogmatics.
Dogmatics from Asterix, yeah. So I feel that we have to cultivate a view of the world that allows for all of these diverse perspectives, including diverse opinions of what is beautiful. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. It's a great way to kick off our discussion today. Next, I'm going to have James come and talk to us about beauty in theory. Now, let me see if we can get that set up and share that. So I'm going to stop sharing this.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much to Brandon for organizing this meeting, and everyone every one of you for turning up. It's a slightly warm afternoon, but the topics are even hotter, so you've come to the right place. So it's a very great pleasure to be able to talk to you for about 10 minutes on beauty and theory in science. And the first thing that I'd like to say is that the topic that we're dealing with, the topic that the first speaker dealt with, the topic that will entertain us and intrigue us for the rest of this afternoon, is both a very ancient topic and a very modern topic. And it's an ancient topic because it goes back to some of the foundations of Western philosophy, I think. Much of ancient thought posited a unity of the virtues, the beautiful, the true, and the good. You see that in various different manifestations. One of the manifestations that's best known is the way in which in Homer, for example, you can tell in many respects the character of the person that Homer is talking about from their physical appearance. And so all the best people are not only righteous and act well and are fair and so on, but they're also strikingly beautiful. The beautiful goddesses and the handsome heroes. This might seem like a reference to a far distant conception of the universe, but in fact, I think it still holds sway today, and even in today's science. What to my delight has happened over the past couple of decades, and especially over the past year or two, is that this topic has moved from, as we might call it, myth to true science and to true scholarly investigation. As long as you're happy to talk about the beautiful goddesses and the handsome heroes, as long as you're happy to talk about somewhat mystical connections between the beautiful and the true, you don't get very far in scholarship. It's very difficult to make concrete points. It's very difficult to put forward any claims that are actually testable and that have a relationship to the world that we see in front of us. But once you start applying scholarly study, scholarly approaches to the topic, a number of mysteries either dissolves or evaporates or becomes much clearer. And in this brief talk, I want to mention two approaches that are represented, I think, in today's panel to deal in a scholarly way, in a truly scientific way, I'm tempted to say, with this otherwise slightly amorphous topic. And the first of these is, of course, social science. And I want to illustrate the passage from myth to scholarly study in the social sciences by juxtaposing these two images as if they were two icons of the discussion of the relationship between truth and beauty and aesthetic factors in science under the heading of myth and under the heading of a fully scientific social science. On the left-hand side, you see the seal of the extremely prestigious Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, founded in 1930. And the design of the seal took inspiration from classical motifs, and you see there a personification of truth and beauty intertwined. And in case this classicist message doesn't come across strongly enough, also the words truth and beauty are placed in the seal just to drive the message home. So this is the suggestion, an intriguing suggestion, that truth and beauty in science are somehow connected, but it remains at the level of myth. It's intriguing, it's exciting, it makes you excited, perhaps it motivates you, but you really have no idea what's going on. And on the right-hand side, you see the process of scientification, if you like, of this situation, of this line of thinking. You see here the cover page of the first findings regarding aesthetics of science of Brandon's extremely famous research project, a very wide-ranging research project in empirical sociology. Under the general heading of work and well-being in science. And I've no doubt that when Brandon takes the floor at the end of today's session, we'll be hearing much more about that. But you guessed it from Brandon's own introduction of me, I am not a social scientist, I am a philosopher and a philosopher of science. So to some extent, I'm tempted to say, I think I have to say, Brandon, even social science doesn't have the solution to everything. And I tend to think that we can go even further in a sense, drawing on Brandon's results and other results in social science and move to a philosophical plane. And the situation, the thing that really stimulates the move to philosophy is this, it's the normative question. As you probably know, philosophy is interested, of course, in getting the facts right. Every scientific and scholarly discipline does that. But we're also interested often in philosophy in talking about the warrants, the justification, the normative aspects of science, how to get things right. How to do things the right way, not just getting the facts right, but also getting our processes right and our opinions right. And so we know from Brandon's work and many other statements in science, some of which have been cited by the first speaker, that science finds motivation and delight in beauty. Beauty delights and motivates scientists. But there's a deeper question. Does beauty also hold the key to good science? Is beauty a road to truth? Is beauty a way of identifying truths, of formatting truths, for example? There are many intriguing suggestions, once again, which, again, we're trying to move from myth to scholarly study. Many items of testimony from scientists along these lines. The former speaker mentioned one. I decided to choose some testimony from Oxford. A fellow of Wadham, if I'm not mistaken, Roger Penrose. I'll just read out this short quote. "It is a mysterious thing, in fact, how something which looks attractive may have a better chance of being true than something which looks ugly. I've noticed on many occasions in my own work where there might, for example, be two guesses that could be made as to the solution of a problem. So often it turns out that the more attractive possibility is the true one." So I think we can all agree that if this were the case, then this would form a powerful motivation for scientists. We would be motivated to do science, motivated to try and do good science by the aesthetic aspects of the topic or of our theories. But there's another suggestion that comes across in Penrose's passage here. That's that beauty is a diagnostic criterion, if you like. It's something that can reveal truths. And that's a much stronger view. And it's also a view that it turns out to have a normative characteristic because it deals with what it is to do good science. Now, we need to find an explanation. I contend if we're going to do a scholarly work on this topic as on any other, it's one thing simply to be amazed by quotations such as the ones that I've just given you, to find them intriguing and so on. But we need to do more than that. We need actually to find explanations. And so the question that I've posed myself for a number of years is, what could explain this actually quite puzzling coincidence? What could explain the fact that scientists find theories close to the truth aesthetically attractive? If we accept what Penrose says, then this is one of the features that we see in scientific practice. And what could explain this coincidence? It's not at all obvious that this coincidence should come about. You can easily imagine a possible world in which scientists systematically find attractive theories that show certain characteristics but are not close to the truth. That would, of course, complicate scientific practice a great deal. But if this coincidence holds, then what are explanations for them? There are many possible explanations. I'm going to limit myself to two. The first explanation might be regarded by a philosopher, something like a Platonist, maybe even a Pythagorean account of beauty in science. And that's the idea that it's necessarily the case, it's necessarily true that we find a truth aesthetically attractive. There's something about the harmony, for example, between our brains or our minds and the world in such a way that if a theory is true, we necessarily find that theory aesthetically attractive. I don't think this explanation holds water for a very simple historical reason. Philosophers are willing to use a priori arguments, but they're also interested in what's historically the case. And historical evidence from the history of science suggests that scientists' aesthetic preferences have changed in time. Just to give you a very quick example, there's now much less aesthetic revulsion felt by theoretical physicists at quantum mechanics than there was for a few years after the mid-1920s, when mature quantum mechanics came into being. And so this shows an evolution of scientists' canons and preferences among the aesthetic aspects of their theories. And so there's much more to be said about this. I can't in 10 minutes cover all the terrain, but this is my primary objection for this afternoon against this first explanation. If we reject this first explanation, then we need a second one. And with the second explanation, I'm kind of putting the thing on its head. It's not the case that there is such a thing as a beauty and that's connected necessarily to truth. It's more that the empirical success of theories, the empirical success that a theory that's close to the truth will typically demonstrate, is partly responsible for our finding such theories aesthetically attractive. There's something about the empirical success, the empirical performance of a good theory that retunes, recalibrates our aesthetic preferences as scientists and kind of tunes our aesthetic preferences to just those features that at the moment seem to be correlated with good empirical performance in scientists. And I think we can agree that this would make the coincidence less surprising. It would remove a lot of the mysterious aspects of this coincidence. That's what you want, of course, in scholarly work. If you are talking about myth, it's very nice to have surprising, astonishing coincidences, but in scholarly work, perhaps prosaically, we try to stamp those out in a way. We try to find the mechanisms that underlie apparently strange coincidence, and it turns out in very many cases, of course, that these aren't coincidences at all, but they are the product of certain mechanisms and certain structures which we haven't initially identified. Now, an inductive process would ensure this. An inductive process, that's a form of learning by example, learning by experience. If we think that empirical performance shapes our way of thinking, then my mind at any rate immediately goes to inductive processes, learning by induction. And that's why about 25 years ago, I put forward a hypothesis about the ways in which scientists, psychologists, if you like, were shaped and affected by the experience that they have in their work as scientists in identifying theories that have empirically successful track records, have empirically successful empirical performances. I dubbed this the aesthetic induction, and it's a mechanism that explains why, even though at an early stage, a scientist might find a theory that's just been formulated, especially if it's an iconoclastic theory, such as quantum mechanics, aesthetically repulsive. Nonetheless, the preferences of those scientists on the aesthetic plane are worn down, if you like, by the continuing empirical performance, the continuing empirical successes of those theories, until eventually the scientist comes to accept that those theories are aesthetically attractive. Why do they come to accept that? Well, because the scientist's own preferences have evolved according to this process of inductive learning that I've dubbed the aesthetic induction. And so this leads me to the conclusion of this extremely short talk. I think in the course of this afternoon's panel, we're going to see two complementary approaches at work. I think it's certainly fair to say that social science, empirical social science, quantitative social science can ascertain the motivating force of aesthetic factors. Do all scientists feel this force? How strong is this force? All sorts of things that Brandon will be talking to us about a little bit later. Philosophy, on the other hand, that's my own discipline, of course, it's able to investigate the link of these aesthetic factors, which things that really, if you don't mind me saying, Brandon, don't show up on the social scientists' radar. And those are things like rationality, objectivity, and truth. These are typically epistemological, typically philosophical concepts. And so it's up to, I think, the philosophers among us to try to establish, try to ascertain or investigate the connection between beauty and truth under this heading, in this framework. And for what it's worth, I still believe, even after 25 years, that my inductive account explains why scientists' aesthetic tastes are tuned to properties connected with truth. But induction being what it is, this connection is fallible, and so can sometimes lead us astray, which I suspect might be another topic that we'll hear more about later on this afternoon. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was excellent. All right, we're switching now to online presenter. We have Milena joining us, so I will stop sharing this one if I can. Intended.
Hi, can I just make sure that, oh, okay.
Let me
Make
just
sure that you can see me and hear me and everything is working.
Yeah, you're all set.
Fantastic. So should I start presenting?
Yes, please.
Good, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone who is watching online, who is in Oxford. Thank you so much to Brandon for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's a great honor to be in such amazing company. Very sorry not to be there in person. COVID was a lot more of a struggle than I expected, but I'm very pleased to be able to still join the conversation and explore the aesthetics of scientific experiments. So I'm interested in understanding whether experiments in science can be objects of aesthetic appreciation. And the questions that we're going to think about today is whether we can appreciate an experiment for aesthetic reasons, whether we can find, for instance, an experiment beautiful. What would be the focus of this appreciation? What would it mean to say that an experiment is beautiful? What would we actually focus on? And whether there is any stability in how we appreciate aesthetically. This is exactly leading from where James just left us, arguing that there is dynamicity in how we understand beauty in science, and we see discontinuities in science. So how is this to be understood when we think about experimental practice and how much it has changed historically? So I'm going to start by presenting this distinction here. Well, many ways in which we can appreciate aesthetically an experiment. We can appreciate the phenomena that the experiment reveals to us, the instruments that we are using. We can also think about the performance of the experiment itself as something we appreciate aesthetically. This is particularly prominent in earlier experimental traditions where the experiment was practiced as a performance in front of audiences. We also appreciate design of an experiment, and that will be really important to my argument. The very process of conceptualizing a design and a setup for an experiment is also subject to aesthetic judgment and can be appreciated aesthetically. And finally, the results. So let me just give a few examples of all this to illustrate it. So first, the phenomena. This is just a few examples of the kind of amazing things you can see under a microscope if you're in the lab and doing an experiment, but also the kind of instruments you can see if you are, well, depending on which kind of experimental tradition you're part of. The first to the left and to the right, the third picture are from some instruments that we house here in the University of Cambridge in the History and Philosophy of Science department. And they're very clearly, aesthetically very pleasing to look at. They used to be, of course, used. And the experiment in the middle is the pitch drop experiment, which I used to pass by every day on the way to work at the University of Queensland. And that's one of the kind of very public experiments. And it resembles very much the kind of performative experiments that used to be more part of scientific practice. But we can see that the instruments themselves can be very pleasing. And the performance of the experiment can be very much analogous to artistic performance. And here in this famous painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, this is very well illustrated. This is an experiment that was performed with a new instrument, the air pump. And in the early days of the Royal Society, the experiment used to be very much a focal point of appreciation for aesthetic reasons. So it will have audiences where people engage with the experiment and appreciate it, and often appreciate nature as it's revealed to them. And this painting is brilliant because it shows us how many different ways people appreciated aesthetically the experiment, from awe and fascination to even fear, and all of the kind of the diversity of aesthetic responses that would have to the fact that this bird is going to die because they're extracting the oxygen from the cylinder. So the performance is aesthetically appreciated here, and the experiment is like an artist in the middle of the painting. But what I have argued in some of my work recently is that these features are kind of like a nice bonus to have, right? So they're visual features that are very kind of easily perceivable to us, but they're not necessary or sufficient to make an experiment aesthetically valuable or to make it beautiful. We're going to talk more about beauty today. What really matters is this very special relationship between how the design delivers a result and the kind of imagination and creativity, ingenuity that is involved in conceiving such an experimental design. So let me illustrate this a little bit more. In one of these famous experiments, Foucault's pendulum, we see this really well illustrated. It was an experiment that clearly had some very visually pleasing features. It was basically a brass ball that was hung from a rope in Paris's Pantheon, and people would go to see it. As you can see here, there was always an audience admiring it, beautiful pendulum swinging around. But what's beautiful about this experiment has nothing to do with that. I mean, okay, very nice that we can see something visually pleasing, but what is really ingenious about it is how simple the experimental design is for the purpose that it had and the significance that it had. The significance is really important. This experiment with this very simple setup shows something very previously disputed, and that was that the Earth rotates around its axis. And the experiment delivered that by simply showing that after some time of this pendulum swinging, the sand underneath, the lines that the ball had made, were not aligned with each other. So really important results delivered by a very elegant, very simple design. And this is what I think makes this experiment beautiful. The visual features are kind of secondary to this much more substantial beauty that we find in how the results are delivered by a very, very good design for purpose. Similarly, in biology, we celebrate the Meson-Star experiment because it delivered important results to a really, really important question, and it delivered them in a really ingenious way. So this experiment has received the title of the most beautiful experiment in biology for good reason. As historian Hans-Peter Fischer has argued, there was something really ingenious about how the experimental design was basically set up. Beautiful idea to use basically the method of centrifugation, to use density to study the genetic material through the generations as they did in order to determine how it changed. And there was some simplicity, as historian Frederick Holmes argues, in this setup, in the steps that they followed. So simple, elegant design, but the results that the experiment delivered were also incredibly significant. James Watson, one of the discoverers of the double helix structure of DNA, argued that this experiment was ingenious because it gave a simple answer to a question. We treat this experiment as an example of a crucial experiment in science because it delivers these really important, straightforward, easy results, right? It's not a messy result. It's really quite clear, speaking in favor of one of the three contenders at the time of how DNA would replicate. Semi-conservatively, the answer was, and Peter Fischer argues against that the experimental results just spoke for themselves. There was no need to replicate them. No further commentary was necessary. And Holmes argued that there was this immediateness about them, that there was a singular historic event. We didn't have to worry to redo these experiments many times. Of course, recognizing that that's quite unusual, but that was one of the aspects that was really valued about how the experiment delivered its results. And what's worthwhile noting here is that so far we have these two experiments as examples of beautiful experiments that clearly delivered an answer to a question and delivered an answer to a question that aligns with expectation. Right, in the first case, we have a demonstration of a phenomenon that was expected. And here we had the selection of a hypothesis among three contenders at the time, aligning against the expectation. Sometimes things don't go like that though. In science, we have sometimes experimental results that will not align with expectations. So the question is, what happens there? Are they then making the experiment aesthetically disvalued? We can think about the Michelson-Morley experiment as an example of something like this and how it has been praised by scientists as a very beautiful experiment. Albert Einstein himself argued that Michelson was an artist in science, the artist in science, right? Really highly praised for his aesthetic sensibility, who took great pleasure and great joy in the beauty of the experimental setup and the elegance of the method that he employed. And historian Gerald Houghton argued again about the ingenuity of just setting up the experiment and building the instruments necessary to achieve the goal of the experiment. Nobody before Michelson was able to imagine and construct an apparatus to measure the second-order effects of the presumed ether drift. He argues that the interferometer was a lovely thing. So what happens in these cases where we have results that don't necessarily align quite with expectation, but are really well set up for purpose? I think we should understand them still as beautiful, but understand the nature of significance in a slightly different way. So by significance of results, we can think about them as going our way when we have a demonstration of a phenomenon or confirmation of discovery. But also sometimes we have these disruptive results that are really productive. Not every now result will be like that. But sometimes, like in this case with the ether, not detecting the ether, actually was what was significant and what was really good about this result, this experiment. And so I've argued that we should really think about this kind of productive disruption as part of being a significant result, and that makes an experiment really beautiful, by the kind of significance it had in revising beliefs, opening conversation, and reconsidering fundamental assumptions that are being made. If an experiment can do something like that, that also should be considered as part of being significant and well made for purpose. So the framework I'm suggesting here argues for the following things: that experiments can elicit aesthetic responses. These can be very pleasing, but sometimes disturbing as well. And that's very analogous to how we appreciate artworks. Not every appreciation of an artwork is pleasing or is simply appreciation of beauty as something that's very easy to process. Sometimes they are disruptive as well. I've argued that the visual features are really nice to have sometimes, and they're not essential for us appreciating an experiment as beautiful. The beauty judgments really pertain to how the design and the significance of the results are intertwined, and how they reveal ingenuity in the setup of this kind of appropriate design for purpose. And I think I want to kind of go back to what James was arguing just 10 minutes before about the fact that we can change the way we experience beauty in science. Clearly, experimental results and experimental setups today are very different. How we get to our results is very different. We use machines. The setups are very different, very big machines, very big detectors, nothing to do with the 17th century experimental setups that we see, the tabletop experiments. The experiments look so different, they're practiced so differently. So how can we talk then about having some kind of notion that employs to all of these particular setups? I think thinking about beauty as a functional notion will help to see that we can still praise that kind of relationship between design for purpose, even if we recognize that the setups are very different. So how will we actually materialize a really good design for purpose will definitely be changing depending on the kind of area that we're studying and the kind of setup that is available to us. But this, I think, can maybe unify the different ways in which we practice experimentally. So this is from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of the talks.
Oh. Right, we're moving back from philosophy to science. I'd like to invite my co-host, Rob Gilbert, up, and we'll switch to his slides here. As soon as I get.
Thank you, Brandon, and it's lovely to be here. As Brandon says, I'm going to talk about nature and data and beauty in those. And for me, as also for colleagues that I work with, nature and data come together under the topic of biophysics. And what I'm going to say, happily, is going to follow on nicely from the previous three presenters. It follows on from what Ben was talking about, in the sense it's very much a personal response from me, coming out of my work over the years, working with nature and data in the biophysical field. In terms of James's presentation, I find myself kind of close to his explanation too, happily again, but I would extend it by saying that I think that the ways in which people learn to appreciate beauty in the world outside science also feed into the way in which we use beauty as a heuristic in science. So I actually think that even from childhood, the way in which we learn to appreciate the world helps to shape our aesthetic senses, and those aesthetic senses then help us to understand things as beautiful when we come to study them scientifically. And then in terms of what Milena was talking about, again, happily it follows on because there is some reference to experimentation. I do see an experiment itself and the grappling with things that experimenters engage in. I find that to be something which is aesthetically pleasing in itself, particularly around the concept of play. Oh, sorry. Okay. So, and in terms of what I want to talk about, I'm actually going to group the points I want to make, which, as I say, come very much from my personal point of view, under a series of more general terms, which you will find used in all sorts of other kinds of discourse, because I think they are helpful ways to think about the kinds of applications of perceptions of beauty that are going on in these different areas of science. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is a couple of examples of idealism. This also happily follows on from Milena, because this actually relates to the Mieselson and Stahl experiment that she was talking about. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see a famous cartoon drawn by Watson and Crick for their paper published in 1953 describing the structure of DNA. And if you read that paper, a very short paper, which you'll be able to find on the Nature website, I'm sure perhaps you've all read it, you will remember if you've read it, or you'll find if you go and read it, that it's framed very much in ideal terms. It's very much about what would be neat given the data we've got. There were certain bits of information they had, but they needed to put them together into a satisfying whole, and they came up with the double helix hypothesis, which turned out to be entirely correct, essentially, and which leads on, of course, on the right-hand side to the experimentally determined structures for DNA itself, and the more complicated RNA, which has because of a particular chemical modification in ribose compared to deoxyribose, has a much more complex range of folding patterns. But at the core idea that Watson and Crick came up with was correct, that base pairing leads to the double helix. The reason it relates to Milena's talk and to the Mieselson and Stahl experiment is that, again, very famously at the end of the 1953 paper, and sort of with their tongue in their cheek, Watson and Crick said, "It has not escaped our notice that this structure suggests a possible mechanism for the replication of DNA." And of course, their mechanism was exactly the mechanism which Mieselson and Stahl went on to show was correct, the semi-conservative hypothesis for DNA replication. So that was an idealistic process. Idealism 2 here is, to get another example, which is, in this case, relates to symmetry, I guess, as does the DNA example. Also, Watson and Crick, in 1956, published again in Nature a paper describing what they thought the structures of small viruses would be like, and they needed to solve the problem of how it is that you can enclose a genome with a protein that it's encoded, and this is a basic problem to do with the size of the molecules. And they came up with some simple ideas about how you could essentially organize triangles in order to generate closed structures which would enclose the genomes of viruses. They did it perhaps informed by knowledge about the platonic solids, which you can see some ancient dice down below replicating those, the 5 platonic solids, of which the one which gets the most complex structure with the simplest shape is the icosahedron, and that was indeed what they proposed would be the structure of small viruses. And this is essentially as a theoretical paper by Watson and Crick, which turns out when you solve the structure of viruses like the blue tongue virus or any number of other isometric viruses, and this was a paper published, as you can see, 25 years ago or so by some colleagues of mine here in Oxford. The blue tongue virus, 100 million Daltons, the largest structure to be solved at the time, 720 copies of one protein forming outer shell, 120 copies of another protein forming an inner shell, the DNA, the double-stranded RNA of the genome also being resolved. It essentially has this icosahedral symmetry, and so their theory is correct. But of course, all symmetry is not perfectly isometric, and so you can also play with the same ideas to come up with something which is more distorted, but nevertheless has the same core idealistic senses behind it. And in fact, the structure of the HIV capsid turns out to use that idea. It also, like icosahedra of an isometric form, has 12 pentagonal vertices, but they're arranged in a different set of positions to where you would find those 12 pentagonal vertices in blue tongue virus, where they're arranged isometrically. And so in HIV, you get a distorted cone. And so you can see idealism 2 here is how people are playing with symmetry and ideas of what would be fitting, and we'll come on to fit in a more general sense in a moment, to come up with theories which turn out to be correct for how it is that nature is ordering itself chemically. And I want to go on to observation, and this relates directly to what Milena was talking about. I want to say, first of all, something about poo sticks on the left-hand side. So poo sticks is here because I think that many experiments, if not all experiments, have a close relationship to play. And play, from my point of view, is an aesthetic experience. It's something that we enjoy and have delight in. And the reason why I choose poo sticks is because many of the kinds of experiments that I would do or colleagues of mine would do involve taking our sample we want to study, placing it in some kind of medium and exerting some kind of force on it, such as, for example, Milena referred to centrifugation used in the measles and the Stahl experiment. What they did was that they centrifuged the DNA to separate it differentially depending on how dense it was. And that is placing their DNA in water and gravitationally spinning it, and then you get movement of the thing and you follow how it moves, and that tells you something about the structure of the DNA. Poo sticks is relevant because many of the systems that we study involve taking our system, placing it in a medium of different kind and applying force to it. And that is very playful, actually, and it feels very playful. There's an enjoyment in grappling with the experiment, and so that's why poo sticks is a good analogy. The diamond light source down the road at the Harwell Research Campus, Milena also referred to the much larger experimental machinery we now use. The diamond light source is an example of one such system. It's a very bright source of tunable X-rays. It's how you determine structures like the virus structure I showed in the previous slide. And again, there is delight in the design of huge machines with highly sophisticated physics behind them, which enable you to achieve the biological question, answering the biological questions you wish to. But we can observe more directly, and you can see a movie down here taken using a technique called atomic force microscopy of a conformational change occurring in a protein that we work on as it in this case, attacks bacteria. And you can see that there's a clockwise movement as it undergoes its conformational change, which is a brightening of the whole structure. So there's delight in observation as well, which I think feeds into our aesthetic experience in science. Another way in which aesthetics comes into sight, into the kind of data and nature area that I want to talk about, and particularly in biophysics, is that we can represent our systems in ways which people commonly will find aesthetically pleasing. We can depict structures of proteins like this protein, this perforin protein forming a pore. We can depict them as attractive ribbons. We can color them nicely. In a trivial sense, this is aesthetic, but people do kind of like it. They do warm to the representations that you can give. You know, they will even sometimes ask you, are they really that color? And of course, they're not really that color. It's a way that enables us to try and depict an idea that we want to come across with. But this is pulling together a whole load of data we've got into a movie, which enables us to explain ourselves. Representation is another form of aesthetic process, in this case, aesthetic kind of discourse, if you like, in biophysics. And then form kind of pervades the issue of how we see beauty in nature and data. The form of an alpha helix on the left-hand side there, the form of in this case, the SARS-CoV-2 spike, which is the bit of the protein that attacks our ACE2 proteins on human cells in order to insert into them. The forms which we might be able to relate to other forms in the world. So colleagues of mine studying the SARS-CoV-2 spike noticed that the receptor binding domain bore a resemblance to a torso, such as you might find in a Greek statue. And so that enabled them to organize their thinking as to where antibodies were binding and where the more powerful antibodies were binding. So you can see there's a kind of pooling together of different aesthetic senses in order to bring out some general ideas or some take-home messages that people wish others to understand from their work. And it's about the form of the information and how we can display it. And then fit. I said I would mention fit, and this is kind of relates also to things like DNA, where clearly we're talking about the fitting together of two strands. But fit, and this for me was how I really got into a sense of the beauty in science, and really what led me to become a biochemist, the fit of molecules together. This molecule, something called EDTA, bound to a divalent cation, a metal ion, or the fit of drugs to target enzymes we might be trying to inhibit, and that's a structure of Paxlovid, which is a commercially marketed, it's now available in the clinic, inhibitor of the SARS-CoV-2 polymerase, and that is now out there, marketed. It's enabling people to better fight off the coronavirus. But what enabled that work to be done was solving structures and then aesthetically engaging with them and building models into those structures in order to understand how we could inhibit the enzyme, and having inhibited, then how we can design more powerful drugs in order to inhibit it better. And that's exactly what that paper describes. And finally, I think uniqueness is something which you find as an aesthetic principle in general. There's the uniqueness of a single rose petal, the uniqueness of anything isolated that grabs our attention in the wider world. But I think in nature and data, in biophysics, there's a sort of uniqueness even to things which show no apparent order that you can easily perceive, no symmetry, but the unique complexity of something like the ribosome and the ways in which the bits of RNA and protein come together to form that structure are, it seems to me, another way in which aesthetics is experienced by people studying nature with data, as it were. And so I've had these 6 kind of key ideas: idealism, observation, representation, form, fit, and uniqueness. They are all different ways, practical ways in which I think aesthetics drives or is an experience engaged with by scientists in studying nature with data, in doing biophysics. And if I had to group them all together in terms of what is going on, I think that the scientists are recognizing something when they see beauty in their data, or find beauty in their experimental, what the experiment is showing them, or the structure they determine. And also there is a delight that they have, and this would apply to the experimental process as well as to the actual results that you achieve, and which delight you with their form, with their fit, with their uniqueness, the way they represent a new understanding to you, and with the idealism that they might elicit from you as to how this system might work. And now I'll finish.
Thank you, Rob. That's really excellent. And from biology, we moved back to physics, and I will invite Sabine up as I find these slides.
I'm not a historian, and I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not a philosopher either. I'm just your average theoretical physicist. And I guess the reason I ended up at this meeting is that I wrote a book which is called Lost in Math. And I apologize to the British part of the audience for the lack of an S. Though, as you can see in the top right corner, the French, for some reason, used the English title in the British spelling. So this book is very much a personal story. It's my own story. I was trying to figure out what criteria I should use to pick a research topic. And my work has mostly been in the foundations of physics, by which I, broadly speaking, mean those areas where we're concerned with the really, really big questions like what is time? How did the universe begin? What is matter made of? That kind of stuff. So all of what I'm about to say is really about the foundations of physics, not about physics in general. As you can see, the subtitle of the book was How Beauty Leads Physics Astray, and writing a popular science book, so this was my first popular science book, has certainly been an interesting experience, and I found out there is a significant fraction of people who think that by reading the title of a book, they can tell what comes in the 300 pages afterwards. A lot of those people got away with the idea that I'm saying scientists shouldn't talk about beauty, talking about beauty is bad, 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 don't do it. Now, I would like to think that the opinion that I expressed in the 300 pages that followed the title was a little bit more nuanced. there are many reasons that scientists talk about beauty, and I'm certainly not saying all of them are bad. Like we've heard many of those reasons already. For example, it's a motivation for them. It's an inspiration. It gets them into science. And I traveled around for my book and I interviewed a lot of physicists, and they brought up all kinds of reasons for me, to me about why they like to talk about beauty. You can find them in the book. I'm going to pick one in particular, which already came up. So this is a quote from Gilbert, who won the Nobel Prize for the quark model. And he said in a TED talk, "What is especially striking and remarkable is that in fundamental physics, a beautiful or elegant theory is more likely to be right than a theory that is inelegant." And this might sound really familiar to you now, because if you remember Penrose's quote, which came up in an earlier talk, was pretty much exactly the same. And I could go on like for half an hour with quotes like this. It's a very, very common attitude that you find in the foundations of physics. And I've grown up believing this because everybody says it. And I mean, when I say grow up, I mean grow up academically. It's like really common that people tell you this, like that your sense of beauty is a good guide to the development of new models, to our understanding of nature. And this, to me, is kind of weird that I stand here and say this today, because it doesn't make any sense. You know, once you start thinking about it, you begin to wonder, why should it be the case, right? Why can I use my sense of beauty to kind of magically figure out what's a good theory of nature? But I think the thing is that I never thought about it. It's just that so many people told me this, I never questioned it. And there are lots of problems connected to this, because as Ben said in the very beginning, our notion of beauty dictates, to some extent, what kind of questions we even ask, and also what kind of answers we are willing to accept. In the foundations of physics in particular, what's happened is that pretty much everyone uses the same notion of beauty, and that leads them to discard a large number of theories, which is really a problem. And what's happening there is that we use this notion of beauty, which we have learned to identify in successful theories, and then we try to use it to develop new ones. But this keeps us getting stuck with the same type of theories, and it's just not working. And I always refer people to James' book about how the notion of beauty may change with paradigms. So it's a pleasure to finally meet him after I've referred to his book so many times. There are many examples in the history of science and physics in particular, where what's changed in a paradigm shift was actually our notion of beauty. And he already said, quantum mechanics is an example, but there's also been the shift from a more mechanical worldview to one based on the notion of fields that extend through space. Or another example that most people are actually familiar with is the shift from cyclical orbits for the planets to elliptical orbits. And in all those cases, at the time, people thought that the new thing is really ugly. But today, physicists just accept it. It's just the way that it is. And I don't think they think about it as ugly. And so what happens if we insist on a particular type of beauty in the development of new models is that we get stuck. So in theoretical physics, our models are very, very mathematical, and the type of beauty that theoretical physicists talk about is correspondingly basically mathematics. And I'm not going to explain exactly what I mean by those three hidden rules of physics, as I call them. They are basically technical mathematical requirements that people use in theory development, and they're hypotheses, but their status as a hypothesis has become forgotten. And that's the problem. I think this is why we've gotten stuck. I should maybe say that this notion of simplicity, which physicists use, is very strongly based on symmetry. So it probably has an evolutionary origin to some extent. We just find symmetry pleasing to look at. And we see this in the development of new models in the foundations of physics. And that has consequences. There are lots of theories and predictions that have come out of theoretical physics based on arguments from beauty, based on asking certain questions about the theories that we currently use. They have perceived shortcomings because they're not beautiful enough. And there are lots of particles that physicists have proposed to remedy this perceived lack of beauty in the theories that we have. Axion supersymmetry, string theory, you've probably heard of this. WIMPs is a particular type of dark matter, and lots of other things that physicists have looked for in dozens and dozens of experiments, and they haven't found anything. And I think, well, that's a problem. So why do they do it? Well, like this is, I still find this perplexing, I have to say, because it's once you start thinking about it, it doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you expect your personal notion of beauty to be a good guide to the development of new theories? So, and I think there are a number of reasons for this. One is social reinforcement. I already talked about this briefly in the beginning. It's just you hear it so often and no one questions it, that you just accept it as true, like the same way that I accepted it as true. There's also a certain lack of philosophical grounding, because if you actually were aware that it's a metaphysical requirement that has no backup in evidence, then you might question it more readily. There's also a lot of cherry picking history. If you think of these quotes, which I mentioned, like the one from Gell-Mann and from Penrose, and you could add many others. Feynman already came up. There's also Paul Dirac, you could add him, and a lot of other people that you can add there. Frank Wilczek, for example, has written an entire book about beauty in the foundations of physics. What do all those people have in common, aside from being men? They've all won a Nobel Prize. So there's a certain selection bias. We only take note of the people who have been successful and who then attribute their success to their sense of beauty. But in the history of physics, there have been lots of theories that were once considered beautiful that just didn't work. And on the other hand, there are lots of ugly theories that actually do work quite well. And finally, there are lots of cognitive biases. For example, they're just, some people who I interviewed just said, well, if it's not beautiful, I don't want to work on it. And I mean, who am I to blame them, right? But this is a very strong selection for the kind of theory that we work on. Okay, so I don't know about you, but I would certainly like to see progress in the foundations of physics in my lifetime, which brings up the question, well, what to do? But I think the most basic thing we can do is to increase awareness among working scientists. I think that to be a good scientist, one needs a certain amount of knowledge about the history of science, the sociology, and the philosophy, which is why I think that events like this are really, really important. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, that was really fantastic. And now I will try to find my own slides here. And hopefully tell you about, not about something completely different, but so we've talked about you know, the role of physics, the role of truth and beauty in physics and biology, and the role of beauty in scientific theories and scientific experiments in biology as well as in physics, and especially how in theoretical physics and fundamental physics, beauty could lead us astray. I've been reading some of this literature for the last few years and have been really trying to think about, well, there's an empirical question here, which is to what extent do scientists actually subscribe to some of these beliefs? To what extent do they share the perspectives of a Feynman or a Gell-Mann, or to what extent do they find the kind of delight in the kind of recognition, for instance, that Rob was talking about? And so I set out to try to address this question through a research project where we really wanted to get at, by the way, here some more beautiful images from the James Webb telescope. Those of you who might recognize, they just came out. I tried to get at, well, what does beauty mean to not Nobel Prize winners, but to ordinary scientists? What does it mean to people? Where do they experience beauty? Is it really in the eye of the beholder? Is it idiosyncratic, or are there patterns shared in disciplinary communities? How do scientists experience beauty as well as awe and wonder in their scientific work? And how do these experiences shape the practice of science, if at all? And what are the implications of these kinds of aesthetic experiences for things beyond theory choice? So do they affect well-being, motivation, recruitment, retention, and so on in science? So those are some of the kinds of questions I set out to answer. This large project that we call Work and Well-being in Science. It's a weird title, but the reason for the title, even though the focus of the study was principally on trying to understand the role of aesthetics in science, we didn't want to put aesthetics in the label of the study because we didn't want it to be biased towards only those who cared about aesthetics. So, so we included aesthetics as one of many things that we were studying. The study was carried out last year in 2021. It's a big survey in 4 countries, the US, UK, Italy, and India. There are a number of reasons why we chose these countries. Principally pragmatic. We had already been doing some research for a number of years, and we had research teams there. They were diverse enough in terms of the R&D, or dedicated towards science, the research infrastructure, cultures, and so on. I can go into more details for those of you who like later on. And just to give you a sense of what we try to do, by scientists here, we just mean physicists and biologists. Sorry for chemists and others in the room. We just had to keep the study manageable, and we just chose 2 disciplines, 2 core disciplines that, as Ben told us at the beginning, have pretty interesting differences aesthetically that we thought would be worth exploring. And the sample to which, or the population to which we want to generalize is scientists working in PhD granting institutions and research institutes in physics and biology departments. So we got an entire list of all of these scientists, and then we sent out survey invitations to them. Nobody likes taking surveys, so we got 3,500 responses from about 22,000 scientists that we tried to invite. A number of universities essentially blocked our study, so they did not believe that we're not spammers, and so it was really challenging to do this study. But we got a 15% response rate, and then we've weighted our results to that population, which you'll see in what follows. And after doing these surveys, we also interviewed scientists. We interviewed 215 scientists in depth for about an hour to hour and 15 minutes to gain their thoughts on this matter. I won't spend too much time on the demographics, but just to give you an idea, so this is the distribution. We have 16% from the US, 27% from the UK, 39% from India, 19% from Italy, 40% female, 52% physicists, and then the distribution by position somewhat reflects the distribution in the population, right? So nearly 40-something% are graduate students. And so the analysis that I present to you are weighted back to the population. So the first thing I want to look at is, okay, so what do scientists mean by beauty? And to ask this question, we actually spent a couple of years doing pilot work where we went and interviewed a number of scientists in these countries and just asked them, what do you mean by beauty? And so, we had some of the literature, the work that Sabine had done and that James has done and so on. We also wanted to hear from scientists, when have you encountered anything that you would consider beautiful, or what is the word beauty? What do you associate the word beauty with in your work? And they would give us various answers, and we tried to collate them. And essentially, we found 3 different types of beauty in their responses. And the first is what I would call sensory beauty. And so this is the kind of beauty of phenomena, the beauty of cells and stars, and the beauty of things they observe under the microscope, the beauty of even equations, things they find pleasing or pretty. The second kind of beauty is useful beauty. That's the kind of thing that Sabine was talking about and James was talking about, which is the use of beauty, particularly in theory, as a heuristic, as a guide to truth, right? But even in experimentation, we find scientists use beauty as a guide, in the sense of designing an elegant experiment, or certain kind of aesthetic principles are baked into the design of a good experiment. And finally, the third kind is the beauty of understanding. And this resonates a little bit with what Rob was saying. When things come together, you recognize, that's how this mechanism works, right? So, so those three categories emerged from a broader set of categories that we found. And so these are the kinds of things scientists would tell us that beauty means. The inner logic of systems, the hidden order or patterns that they observe, elegance, simplicity, complexity, symmetry, sense of fit, harmony, pleasing colors or shapes, and finally asymmetry. Very few, but still many. Those who did talk about asymmetry insisted this is really important. It's neglected. But you see that the main category here has to do with this third type of beauty that I was talking about, the beauty of understanding or insight. And then there are things like elegance and simplicity. And these things vary predictably by discipline, just as Ben had talked about. Physicists care mainly about symmetry, and you can see that that first bar there is physics, right? So some 60-something% of physicists find beauty in symmetry, whereas some nearly 70% of biologists find beauty sorry, this is the wrong thing I'm looking at. Complexity is the other thing I was comparing it to. You have physicists who find beauty in symmetry and simplicity, and biologists who find more beauty in complexity. Right? So those are the kinds of disciplinary differences that are really striking. Biologists also tend to find more beauty in pleasing colors or shapes compared to physicists, but both physicists and biologists equally find beauty in this third type of beauty, the hidden order or the inner logic of systems. So the beauty of insight, of recognizing what's going on behind things, seems to be especially important and pervasive. The second question is, where in their work do scientists encounter beauty? So these are the things that they find beautiful, but where do these things emerge? Principally, it's in the phenomena that they study. So 75% of scientists say they encounter beauty, however they define it, in cells and particles and so on, 61% in theories, 54% in teaching, 52% in the process of research, and the rest of it is less prominent. Almost all of these categories were equally likely to be expressed by physicists and biologists, except for two of them, which is not surprisingly scientific theories. More physicists find beauty in scientific theories than biologists do. So that's like 73% of physicists and 49% of biologists find beauty in scientific theories. And then the writings of prominent scientists, that's the only other area where 40% of physicists compared to 31% of biologists found those beauty in those areas. What we don't really see very much of is beauty in scientific workplaces. For instance, many complain to us about working in horrible labs in basements without windows and so on. And that raises some interesting questions about well-being that they brought up themselves. I'll give you a couple of examples from our interviews about the kinds of beauty they experienced. One told us, if you look under the microscope, there are experiments that are more exciting because there's a visual aspect to it, and it's exciting to see a cell responding under the microscope compared to having just a graph. Even though the graph, the quantification is equally, if not more important, it's not as satisfying. So seeing structures unfold under the cell, that's beautiful, right? Or putting together these amazing, now this is again beauty in the equipment, right? So not even just observation, but in their equipment. These detectors, and that's, this is one scientist talking about the devices that they put together as being beautiful. And so there's numerous arenas in which scientists encounter beauty, from their theories to their data to nature to the actual objects that they're using. And how frequently do such experiences occur? So we'll ask them a lot of questions about, ranging from never to, a few times a year to monthly, weekly, daily. So we give them those sorts of options, ask them a number of questions. And we see that certain kinds of aesthetic experiences are pretty frequent. So at least a few times a year, 86% of scientists said that they felt pleased by the elegance of a scientific object. 86% also were thrilled by a new insight. At least a few times a year, 83% felt their research opened up new mysteries. There's a Feynman quotation here. He talks about an argument with an artist friend of his who complained to him that you physicists, you just reduce things. You don't understand the beauty of a flower. Feynman would say, I know the deeper structures of a flower, and therefore I have greater aesthetic experience. And so the science knowledge doesn't reduce, but it only enhances the sense of mystery. And so this is the sense that most scientists see several times a year, the sense of mystery opening up. 81% felt a sense of childlike delight or joy, as Rob was talking about during their work. 68% felt pleased by encountering symmetry in scientific equations, models, or data. So not just physicists, even biologists find some delight in symmetry. And 66% were pleased by the surprising discovery of a hidden order or deeper systems. Right? So these things occur somewhat frequently in scientific life. And so you have these aesthetic experiences. When are they relevant? When are they important in science? There are a number of interesting differences between physicists and biologists here. Where they share commonalities are when they present or communicate scientific results and when they analyze or interpret scientific results, right? So communication, interpretation, aesthetic criteria matter equally to physicists and biologists. Where you have some differences are biologists seem to find more beauty more relevant in the design of a project, in making observations in the lab or in the field, in developing a project plan or grant applications, whereas physicists tend to find beauty more commonly in writing code and in doing theoretical calculations, right? So there are some differences and some similarities again. I'll give you a couple of examples. As one biologist told us, I try to make our experimental design as elegant and as direct as possible, which for me is a form of beauty because the less effort we put into getting an answer, the better. The faster, the cleaner, the fewer different parameters, the more convincing and clean the information will be, right? So you intentionally don't want to design a messy and ugly experiment, is what we learned. Beauty is also socialized and communicated in scientific disciplinary communities in a number of ways. So a number of scientists said that they pay attention to aesthetic aspects of their colleagues' work. 55% say they care about aesthetics at things like conferences or discuss what they find beautiful in science with their colleagues and students. Fewer scientists said that they've changed their minds about what counts as beauty during their career, or that they heard their supervisors refer to aesthetic aspects of science. One of the things you got to take with a grain of salt is this is all self-report. I don't know how self-aware these scientists are of how often they're, aesthetic factors are being communicated to them by their colleagues and so on. And so the question of cognitive bias it's not something that self-reported data is very good at actually getting at, right? We don't really know how much cognitive bias there is in science, and people are rarely capable of recognizing it in themselves. Okay, so what? So what are the consequences then of encountering beauty in science? Well, we talked about motivation. 62% of scientists say that encountering beauty motivated them to share the beauty of science. Similar percentage said that it motivated them to pursue a scientific career. 57% say that encountering beauty improves their scientific understanding. So it's an asset to understanding. 50% say it helped them persevere when they experience difficulties or failure, motivates them to communicate science to their public. The places where you find some differences disciplinarily are more physicists are likely to say that encountering beauty gives them confidence in their results compared to biologists. And similarly, more physicists are likely to say that encountering beauty makes them think that they're on the right road to reach truth in their investigation. Right? So there seems to be a greater sense among physicists that beauty is a reliable guide to truth. Again, in terms of consequences, one of the researchers we talked to told us, I don't think you really enter academia unless you've had that sense of encountering beauty. This is a bit of a rat race. The whole time you have to be struck by the beauty of all of it, either the process or just the universe or whatever. Otherwise, you wouldn't do this. Why would you do all this? And this is one of the things that actually motivated my own study is in a previous research project, we heard scientists telling us that what made their work worthwhile was, we don't get paid very much. There's a lot of political bullshit to put up with. We do it because it's beautiful. And I wanted to know, well, how pervasive is that sentiment? And this is an attempt to try to understand that. Okay, so how do scientists then evaluate the role of beauty in science? And for this one, we pulled out the theoretical physicists just to get a sense of whether they were any different. And so we have theoretical physics, other physics, and then biology. And here we see there's no difference in answering the question if science helps us better access the beauty that actually exists in the world. This is a kind of claim that Frank Wilczek seems to be making. It is important for scientists to encounter beauty, awe, and wonder in their research. So you've got, somewhat around 70% or so of scientists seem to believe those things, that beauty is really important and it helps us access beauty in the world. Now, when it comes to things like a good theory or experiment needs to be elegant, Gell-Mann. Theoretical physicists are a bit more likely. Now, our sample of theoretical physicists is small, so that error bar doesn't allow us to be confident in some of those distinctions. But certainly when it comes to the idea that a beautiful or elegant theory is more likely to be correct than a theory that is inelegant, that's Gell-Mann again. Definitely physicists, theoretical or not, believe that much more than biologists do. The idea that mathematical beauty is a good indicator of scientific truth, again, physicists are more likely than biologists to believe that. The pursuit of aesthetic considerations like symmetry and elegance is bad for scientific progress. There's equally only about 10% across disciplines seem to think that it's a bad thing, even though they seem to be suspicious of it, right? So they're not entirely sure that beauty is reliable, but they don't think it's bad either. These are questions we asked only of physicists, because in our pilot study, when we tried to ask them of biologists, they laughed at us and said that those questions are silly. So these questions that society should invest more resources to pursue unified theory of physics. Of course, biologists wouldn't really seem to care about that, but there's a bit of difference between theoretical physicists and others. Here's the huge difference. In scientific models and theories, I consider numbers that are much larger or smaller than 1 to be ugly. I think that's the naturalness factor that Sabine talked about. So very clearly, theoretical physicists care about that much more than other physicists. Not much difference in their opposition to Dirac's claim that it is more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment. So only about 10% or so of physicists agreed with that claim, and about something like 80% disagreed with Dirac on that point. So I'm going to stop there. There are a few other considerations, and I'm happy to talk about them later. For instance, we find an important link between aesthetics and well-being in science, and differences across positions. So graduate students are much more likely to experience aesthetic experiences in science, or at least they experience aesthetic experiences in beauty more frequently than scientists across their career stages. And there's an interesting sort of U-shape, little bit of a U-shaped curve, that across the scientific career, the beauty gets beaten out of you by the institutional factors that are in science. But I'll stop there for now, and I think what we'll do is have the panelists come up and chat about what we just talked about, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you all. Maybe we could put Milena up on the screen so she can join us as well, and we could probably all, if all the panelists might come up here, and then we can see if you all have any questions for each other. I'm curious to know if any of these data have raised new questions or new ideas for you all, or if you have ideas that you want to riff off each other. But we can certainly open that up to anyone who has questions or comments. It's a bit unusual with Milena up there, but that's fine. We can see you, so that works.
I for one would be very interested.
Well, let's get the microphone so we can. Yeah.
So I for one, it's up, of course, to our chair, but I would be very interested in hearing comments from the audience.
Absolutely, yeah. We're gonna open it up in just a second, but I just wanted to know if people had any questions for each other on your presentations and any reflections.
All I'd say is I just commented as I did in my talk that I thought was a very happy confluence of ideas among all of us. Actually, I would say I think this emphasis on the human and the personal perspective, I think, is and the experiential and the way in which things are just found to work, and that is found to link to aesthetic experience or response, does seem to be something that's a common thread, and that's a nice thing to find. But I think it's very good to be warned about the fact that it's the successful people who speak and it's the Nobel Prize winners who have their quotes banded around. And and that elegance isn't always the guide to the truth. But that's just one comment.
Yeah. I was wondering, James, I mean, when you were talking about the success of theories, Sabina's made this point too, that there's also the socialization process in science where you are in an institutional environment. So perhaps I wonder if, it's not just the success or track record of a particular theory, but also the sort of social dynamics of people wanting to go where the money is, wanting to go where there's funding, and then people with funding want to protect themselves and not have any threats to that, that particular line of inquiry. So people have complained that string theory has been for perhaps too long, too well funded, and critiques were, perhaps not as not as difficult it was not as easy to challenge some of those sorts of ideas. So I wonder what you think the role of not just rationality, but also some of those other factors like institutional resources and imitation and wanting to be like the successful people and not just imitate successful ideas might play. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Yes. Well, I would say make 2 points. The first is that this inductive process is very largely socially implemented. It's not an induction that one conducts in the privacy of one's study. It's something that is mediated by the academic community, the particular scientific community, and it's also carried out and transmitted largely in the form of training. So it's a large part of your training that you are socialized to find certain theories and approaches aesthetically attractive. So that's certainly one heading in which the social process is important. You, of course, mentioned some more complex processes, follow the money, invitations, and so on. I would respond to that if the scientific, the branch of science in question is well organized and truth apt, then that sort of thing does, or at least should, attract empirical success too. So it may well be, as a sociologist, you may well tell me, no, prizes are awarded on a quite different basis, invitations are awarded on a quite different basis, and so on. But if it's run in as a truth apt enterprise, then we're giving our top prizes to the people whose theories, in a sense, that's not the only reason, but if they are theoreticians whose theories have a certain track record of empirical success. And so it all comes right in the end.
Maybe I can add something. I think part of the drive towards beauty, especially in the very theoretical parts of physics, is kind of baked into the way that we decide whether something is successful. Because most often when you're trying to get something published or you're trying to get something funded, it depends very strongly on how many people like your work. And physicists like beautiful theory. So if you're working on something that's perceived as beautiful, whether or not it's empirically adequate, it makes it more likely that other people also want to work on it. And that makes your life much, much easier. And I think that's certainly one of the reasons why ideas like string theory and supersymmetry have carried on so much, because people just like to work on it because it's beautiful.
Should we open up for questions? Please, what questions do you all have, or comments, or yeah? If you want to just introduce yourself, just tell us your name, where you're from.
Yeah, hey, I'm Kavir. I'm a philosophy student here in Oxford. So, I mean, just a quick question, I think directly related to one of the surveys that you showed, and this is to everyone in the panel and what their thoughts are. I think what I was interested in, there's the very nice asymmetry between beauty and good science. So I think you showed that, around like 80% of biologists and physicists believe that science helps us appreciate beauty, or there's an implication from good science to beauty. But the other other way around from beauty to science, that's like around 10%. So there's a very stark asymmetry. So yeah, what's going on there in some sense? Because you would think that, oh, if around like 80%, 85% of scientists think that science, good science, or at least good science gives you some grasp of beauty, then the reverse implication that something which is not beautiful is not maybe good science, that also holds, even if the other direction doesn't hold. So what's going on there in some sense?
Anyone like to try that? So I mean, I think so. Essentially, the two ideas there was one was that there's objective beauty in the world, and science can help us better understand that. And so, like, I think the quote from Wilczek is that the natural world embodies beautiful ideas. And so, yeah, I think a number of scientists have basically said that science gives us access to, it helps us to better understand the things that we find beautiful, right? So that's because it gives us more knowledge into things. Whereas the other idea was that beauty matters much more than experimentation. I think so that the one that had just the 10% agreement. So it's enough for your equations to be beautiful. And my thought with Dirac, I mean, Dirac's a strange man, but I thought he was essentially very confident that the mathematics will eventually be proven experimentally. I'm not quite sure why. So I think, I mean, maybe Sabine, you might have a better idea, or others might, as to what gives them confidence that even if experimental data today don't seem to corroborate with these beautiful equations, don't worry, just be patient, give it another 50 or 100 years and a few more $1 billion, and then you'll eventually see that I'm right. And it's happened at times. There were times that physicists, I think, stuck to their guns, even though experimental data initially did not support them, and then eventually the experiments proved to have been mistaken. And they're like, see, we told you, our beautiful equations held out. I think you might have a better explanation for why there's that confidence in beauty, even if experimental data may initially not support it. But that's only held by a very small minority of physicists, and I don't know why they would hold to that.
So I'm not entirely sure I correctly understood the question. Let me just try to say it in my own words. Is the question like, if you ask scientists, does a good theory have to be beautiful? They'd say like, yeah, well, maybe I'm not perfectly convinced. But if you ask them, would you accept an ugly theory? They would say like, no. Basically this discrepancy between the answers.
Not specifically to Dirac's point, but I was just saying that I saw that there was an asymmetry between scientists saying that science helps us appreciate beauty, or makes us appreciate beauty in some sense. That was the first. But there was another kind of survey statistic that you showed, which said that whether beauty helps us track truth or track whatever the enterprise of science is, and that was also quite low throughout biologists and physicists. So there is this asymmetry, right? Because many people, the vast majority, think that science can lead to appreciation of beauty, but really not many people think that beauty can lead to whatever the aim of science we take it to be, whether truth or empirical adequacy or so on and so forth. So there's this asymmetry, and it seems, well, I don't know if it seems surprising or not.
Well, so they would say to me that beauty can help with scientific understanding. So beauty, they do say there's quite a few, like more than like nearly 60% say that beauty helps with scientific understanding. Where they would disagree is that beauty is a reliable guide to truth, and they would say that it's in many ways, I think, echoing your cautions. Maybe they've all read your book, because I was surprised to find that some of those statistics were so low. They seem very reticent, even in their interviews. They would say, yeah, beauty could be a guide. And, even Ben, as you say at the end, it's not, beauty can mislead us. And scientists seem aware of that by and large, that just relying on beauty isn't going to do it. And
can I just ask something, kind of join in as well? I'm not sure whether I should just jump in and interrupt.
Please, yes.
It's awkward. But yes, thank you very much for the question. And I was just thinking about the fact that you don't have to have a true theory to appreciate nature, right? We've appreciated nature for a lot of past false theories. And if you think about experiments, like you can appreciate a kind of an experiment where you're doing something with combustion and think, oh my goodness, this is looking amazing and it's helping me engage in the beauty of nature. If you're thinking this is about phlogiston being released, you have a very false theory and you still are engaging very much aesthetically with what's going on in nature. And so I think there are two very different things, right? The fact that, yes, systematically approaching a phenomenon that is natural through science is one thing. Of course, we're going to find more people thinking that this is where, you know, the beauty is, engaging with nature in this way, than actually saying the much more substantial epistemologically claim that beauty then in our theory guarantees or gives higher likelihood for us to be correct in the kind of answers we're giving. Right? So I think it's different ways in which we're applying the concept. And in one, it's just engagement and perhaps trying to gain understanding, and the other is much more substantial. It's unsurprising, I think, that there's a lot more caution with the second kind of question. Thank you.
Great. Let's do. Sure. Yeah.
I just think it's also worth reflecting that it's possible that the experience of beauty isn't so much a driver as a symptom of something else, which is that it's actually a symptom of the deep engagement of the scientist with whatever it is they're studying. And so personally, that's really kind of where I find myself, actually, that it's more of a symptomatic thing. We experience beauty because we put our heart into it. And when you put your heart into something, you throw yourself at it, that's how you get a full understanding of it. And that means that you learn to love it, or you learn to find it beautiful. And this relates also to what Ben was saying and others, that actually I think there is something, of course there's something adaptive about what we find beautiful, and it's to do with our experience. And it's a symptom, that beauty, experience of beauty is a symptom of what we're doing, which is throwing ourselves at it and opening ourselves to it. So I just think that's relevant to the question. I think people are kind of perhaps being a little bit self-critical and thinking, well, I shouldn't use beauty as a guide to the truth. But actually, I suspect they very often do find, as it happens perhaps by chance, that the things turn out to be true. They do think are beautiful, but I think it's because they've put their all into it to find out what they needed to find. So I just...
Oh, could I say something to follow up on that then? I think that it's interesting that you mentioned, like Dirac, for example. You would think that that very, very highly refined mathematical sensibility, very, very logical, if you like, also comes coupled to this very intuitive feeling, this non-rational part, which is much more emotional, if you like. And in some people, those two things are sort of very, very closely intertwined, that there's such a deep feeling that this has to concord with the truth. I think partly because it's the engagement with the mathematics generates a kind of love for the mathematics. And I mean, I think that there is, I wouldn't really know how to approach the problem, but there has to be a really deep biological basis for this. And I think it might not even be purely a human response. Like Jane Goodall, the primatologist, talks about watching chimpanzees as they investigate a waterfall and conjecturing that they're experiencing a sense of awe when they see this thing, which is a marvel of nature. They adapt their behavior and they start to engage with it and they start to explore it. And so she conjectures, well, they are experiencing something like what we would describe as awe. Now, it has a purpose, though. It means that they engage with that thing and they explore it and they come to know it. So you could see that there's a kind of benefit to that, like evolutionarily, and also in terms of science, that it really draws you into things. And it's not really a rational response. It's something different to that. And you could easily see how those two things could be beneficial in some circumstances and highly non-beneficial in other circumstances, and very, very hard to disentangle, because the one side of it is much more of an emotional response than the other, but sometimes they get intertwined.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know about the high energy physics area, but I can kind of see how that could happen very easily with very particular sensibilities, like, you know, Dirac's, for instance. And if they're held up as the sort of ultimates in that particular discipline or that particular area, and there are additional social biases imposed, you know, for instance, like the quote I gave from Feynman, where he says, inexperienced students. Well, if you're a graduate student learning, feeling your way into that community, you're not going to question that. I mean, you'll just sort of pick that up and take it into yourself. And it becomes internalized to such an extent that you can't really even maybe rationalize it to yourself.
Yeah, no, I think that's yeah, important factors. We got a lot of questions coming in, hands up as well. So let me ask for maybe I'll start collecting questions. I know Leticia has her hand up, or Leticia, feel free to write your question in the chat. We have a question from Deepshika. Do you think the commonality of beauty across scientific disciplines might be indicative of a higher intelligence or power? Let me collect a couple. Sir, from you, you had your hand up there, and then yourself. And we'll collect 3 questions, and then we'll jump to.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Gibbons. I'm a computer scientist. I was wondering about this asymmetry. Gilman and Penrose was saying that a true theory must be beautiful. If it's ugly, then it's not true. But the other side is that, which is Dirac's side, which is a beautiful theory must be true, and that's the controversial one. Perhaps that's the one in the sense in which beauty is not a reliable guide for you. Lots of beautiful theories have been slain by ugly facts. So I wonder if that was the asymmetry that's coming out. So beauty is a characteristic of true things, but not all beautiful things are true.
Right. It can also be a characteristic of false theories.
I will give an illustration to set up the question. It might be a little bit funny of an illustration, but it will set up nice. I always find newborn babies to not be very beautiful. Okay, but a mother will always find the baby to be beautiful, her baby to be beautiful. Now, it might be because she recalibrates her sense of beauty. I don't know. But as the second talk led me to think is that no matter what the final, if there is a final theory of physics be, no matter what the theory is, we will always find it beautiful, no matter what. Is this the case?
Sounds like the conclusion to your book. Feel free to address any of those questions. Anyway, yeah.
Well, yeah. So this is kind of how my book ends. So in the end, I explain I got a new research grant, and I'll work on something, and we will come to find it beautiful. So there's a lot of people were really confused why I said this, but it was exactly this point that I was trying to get across. Like, whatever we will find, if it's correct, we will come to find it beautiful. I should also add something to what you said earlier before I forget about this. A lot of physicists who I talk to who are not in science communication tend to not think about the stuff as beauty to begin with. There are certain mathematical criteria that they use, like unification, for example, the search for a theory of everything, naturalness, and so on, but they don't necessarily put it down as beauty. This is really something you find in popular science writing and that kind of stuff.
Thanks so much. Very interesting questions. One thing that I would say, I think in answer to both, so one of the contributions that I've tried to make is to relativize the category of beauty with respect to history. I think in general, it's a mistake to think that given all the theories in history of science, there's one subset that are strikingly beautiful and another subset that's perhaps strikingly ugly, and these categories never change. To my mind, what counts as beautiful, what is held as beautiful, is highly plastic historically. And so to some extent that solves, if you accept this principle, that solves both the problems. It's not the case that we have this enormous coincidence that it's the beautiful theories that turned out to be true and the true theories. There's an underlying mechanism there. as regards your question, I think the question of babies is a little bit different, just as the question of art, fine art, the sort of art on the walls here, that there's also a sense in which that's beautiful, but I think that's also a different case. I've never suggested that I had a theory of everything in terms of all aspects of beauty. So I think I'll put babies in another category. But it is the case, just as Sabine said, I think that a theory of everything that's endorsed wholeheartedly is going to be a very successful theory. And so will reshape the aesthetic canons, whether at first we thought the theory was ugly or not. And so there is this inevitability of it. The better a theory is, given enough time, the more it's going to center or retune our aesthetic sensibilities, especially in that scientific community, in order to make itself beautiful. So this is not a case of the ugly duckling that turns beautiful. It's largely a case of the aesthetic canons that are reshaped under the impact of the empirical performance. That, in any case, that's how I see it.
And just briefly, and relating to the question that was asked on the screen from Deepshika Sharma about whether which Brandon, you read out, didn't you? Yes. Mm-hmm. Whether the commonality of experience of beauty indicates the existence of a higher power. I'm pretty certain every one of us will have a different answer on this if we wanted to go around. What I would say is I personally, and I'm actually an Anglican priest, as well as the things that Brandon said about me at the beginning. So clearly I do have a commitment to a belief in God personally. But what I would say is I think what I would strongly want to affirm is it emphasizes the importance of the spiritual as a human experience. I think the human experiences are fundamentally spiritual. Love for one another is a spiritual experience. And I think that the fundamental importance of the spiritual, however one understands that within a human life, is indicated by this, I would suggest. What I would also just comment, relating also to this question, is that a comment was made earlier about this, particularly by Sabine, about issues around why should our minds fit these our understanding of the world, and why should the beautiful theories we enjoy fit the way the world is. Now, of course, that does relate to a whole area of argument about the existence of God, where you get very different points of view. Thomas Nagel, an atheist philosopher, thinks that question is very important, but has a non-theistic answer of a kind. And then there's a whole school of people who would try and say, well, the fact our minds fit the way the world is does suggest that we're made in the image of God. That's not what I'm saying, but that is a point of view that is put out there. But as I say, I would say that it underscores the value of the spiritual as a general idea, because human lives are spiritual, basically.
Could I jump in
on please, yes.
the question as well? So just a slightly different way of answering this last question, and actually going back to something that Ben said about how we experience nature. I think you can give an evolutionary answer as to why we feel very happy when we find beauty in nature, but also very happy when our explanations are really elegant and, we find symmetry. It's because we're processing information in this way. And it's easier to process information when things are very neat. And this perhaps, this kind of, call them biases, call them cognitive constraints on our own kind of ways in which we process information from the out world is basically reflective of this. So the experiences of beauty that we have and these constraints we put into the kinds of explanations we want, to the kind of experiments we want to run, perhaps are just reflecting of this cognitive capacities that we have, the very specific cognitive capacity. And as Ben said earlier, it pays off to be able to spot stuff in the world, like to be able to spot patterns, because you will avoid predators, you will survive, when you're spotting symmetries and patterns together. And it pays off to find your baby beautiful because it means they will survive. So another way of thinking about it, not indicating anything to do with higher powers, but just reflecting our own capacities and the human kind of condition of how we process information, and perhaps the aesthetic experiences we have are just either very deeply ingrained in our understanding, or maybe just byproducts of that understanding, of that cognitive success that we achieve. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that the type of aesthetic experience that is shared by most scientists is around insight, right? So it's not the symmetry or the complexity, but it's that ability to grasp the inner workings of the inner logics of things. And so, yeah, I think there are certainly those theological arguments about if we delight in the grasping of logic, then there must be maybe a source of that logic. But I think also, I mean, the question is interesting. In our data, we find there's really we actually have a little bit of data on the religiosity of scientists. There's no relationship between the religiosity of scientists and their frequency of experiences of beauty or wonder. There is, however, a relationship between scientists' sense of spirituality, as they call it, and their frequency of experiencing awe. So the more you experience awe, the more important you would consider spirituality in your life as a scientist. But when it comes to beauty, there's really no difference, at least in our data, with any kind of religious variable.
And I'll just add that it's just that to follow from Milena, that despite what I said about human beings have a spiritual aspect, which is about meaning in our lives, basically, I also believe it's all evolved, of course, and it's all clearly environmentally factored both during our own lives as we evolve as individuals and shape our experiences, and obviously by the fact that we're evolved animals.
Well, I want to recognize that we've reached our time. Certainly, we're after 6 here, so. Please do stick around for refreshments and Q&A with our speakers, and please join me in thanking all of our panelists today, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.